Hello everyone, I'm Laura of Slice of Pie Quilts, and this week in the Exploding Heart Quilt Along, we're going to be sewing the rows together to make the whole quilt top. This is going to be such a fun week to see everybody's heart quilts. Now to sew the rows together, I actually like to sew them in groups of 3 or 4 at a time. And so I'll sew like rows 1, 2, 3, and 4 together and then set those aside. And then sew rows 5, 6, 7, and 8 together and set that aside. So then I can just sew those bigger chunks together later. And that way I'm not feeding a huge piece through my sewing machine every single row that I add. It just helps it make it more manageable to sew it together. Let's get started. Last week I shared that I like to put a numbered pin in the first block of each row in order to help me keep the rows straight, and that is really going to come in handy this week. Remember how I mentioned that in quilting there are lots of ways to do the same thing? That applies here too. I personally don't like to use pins or clips when sewing the rows together, but you might. Do whatever works for you and whatever you like the best. After putting the 2 rows right sides together that I need to sew, I actually only nest the very first seam. So if you remember last week, we pressed all of the seams in the odd numbered rows to the left and all the even numbered seams to the right. Then I go to the sewing machine and start the seam. Now I hold my finger on the nested seam to hold it in place, and I'm only going to sew to that seam. Once I get to the seam, I stop, line up the fabric so that the next seam is also nested. Then I hold my finger on that and go sew just until that seam. Okay, then I can stop, line up the next one, and I keep going all the way to the end of the row. Sometimes you'll find that the corners, the seams, don't match up perfectly. You may have too much fabric on the top like this. You can find that you can pull a little bit on the fabric to stretch it, and that will even it back out. And if you actually don't have enough fabric on the top and you have extra fabric on the bottom, still go ahead and nest the seam and try to hold it in place. And then as you sew, your feed dogs will actually feed the extra fabric in as best as it can. So then you just sew it like normal, and then the corner will match up a little bit better. Sometimes it's just not possible to get the corners to line up. Our piecing is not always perfect. And you know what I like to say? Finished is better than perfect. Don't worry about it, just keep sewing. The numbered pins are really going to help you when it comes time to adding the next row. I like to make sure that I'm following the correct order, lay them right sides together, but then when I go to sew it in my sewing machine, I actually flip it around so that I sew from the end like this, so that the bulk of the fabric is to the left of my needle and not underneath in the arm of my sewing machine, under here in the throat space. And so then I actually go all the way back to the other end in order to start sewing. Then you just do the same thing again. You line up the first, nest the very first seam, and sew to the first seam. Then nest the next seam, and just sew like that until I get to the end of that row. After you've sewn all the rows together, then you need to press your seams. I like to press all of mine in the same direction, but if you like to press yours open, that's definitely something you can do too. Now step back, take a picture, and admire your work. I can't wait to see all of the exploding heart quilts that we've made. Remember to use the hashtag ExplodingHeartQAL or ExplodingHeartQuilt when you post a picture on social media. Be sure to come back next week where I'm going to share some tips on quilting and binding your quilt. Happy quilting!